Nigel Farage is a British politician and a leader of the UK Independence Party, a position he has held from September 2006 to November 2009. He is a member of the European Parliament for South East England and co-chairs the Eurosceptic Europe of Freedom and Democracy group. Minister Farage, welcome to Symban World Radio and to the programme Radio Interviews.
Thank you very much indeed.
How would you explain the Greek tragedy to the people living in Australia, and especially the expatriate Greeks in particular?
Well, you're certainly right to call it a tragedy, because what is going on, and we saw last Sunday in Athens, buildings on fire and 5,000 police preventing the mob from getting into the parliament. So things are very serious and very bad indeed. But people must understand that this is part of a much bigger picture. Several decades ago, after a Europe that had been torn to bits in 2 world wars, there came along the idea of European unity. And on the face of it, it was rather appealing. Yes, okay, let's all be mates together, let's do business together, let's cooperate together on things, and if we do that, perhaps we would never need to go to war with each other. So the idea behind it, rather as the idea behind communism, was based on good intentions. But what nobody understood, the Greeks, the British, or anybody else, was that the real object of this European unity was to, in fact, create a new state, and a state that was to be run from Brussels and run by people who were not elected to office and who could actually never be removed from office. And so what we have here is Greece, a country who joined the European community, a country who mistakenly joined the euro, and when people entered into these agreements, as the Greek government did, there was never any provision within those treaties for anybody leaving in the future. So Greece now finds herself trapped inside a political and an economic prison that is called the European Union, with her democracy stripped from her, with a prime minister who was a puppet, because the last one was removed by the bully boys from Brussels because he dared to say he might give the Greek people a referendum. And the real decisions in Greece are now made by what is called the Troika. And these are 3 foreign, unelected bureaucrats who fly into Athens once a fortnight, one from the European Commission, one from the European Central Bank, and one from the International Monetary Fund, and they tell the Greek Prime Minister what he can and cannot do. And so the country that actually invented a couple of thousand years ago the very concept of democracy has now become a protectorate run by unelected bureaucrats. And this is all in the name of a united Europe. And far from being a united Europe, actually what it's doing is turning the peoples of Europe against each other. It is a tragedy not just for the Greeks, but actually for the whole of Europe too.
But Minister, the austerity measures which the current Greek government is forced to take in return for financial aid, these austerity measures are pushing the country into further recession. Instead of economic growth necessary to pay off the debts, the country is being pushed into further recession as a prerequisite for financial aid. Where is the logic in that?
Well, I agree with you, and in fact, I call this policy sadomonetarism. Which upsets them all, but never mind. It's, when a country's in trouble, what you do to it is make it absorb even more pain. But we really mustn't think of these bailouts as financial aid, because that sounds rather like we're giving money to help out Greece because it can't pay its pensions and it can't pay its bills. The real situation is that Greece has debts that are so big that it cannot even service the interest on those debts. And what the EU is doing is lending them more money so that they can service the debts, so that they can pay back the banks from France and Germany and the United Kingdom who made the imprudent loans in the first place. It's actually pouring good money after bad. It's actually forcing Greece into becoming even more indebted. There is no way this is going to work. And I want to give you just a slight perspective, historical economic perspective. In the 1930s, we had the Great Depression. The Wall Street crash triggered off a chain of events. And indeed, in the United Kingdom, we had the famous Jarrow marches, where people from the northeast of England marched on London, where there were millions of people living on charity, and a pretty rough, difficult time. During that period, in the early 30s, the British economy contracted by about 10%. Let me tell you where Greece is today. Greece has declined. Its economy has contracted now for 5 years in a row. It has already fallen by 13.4%. But now that rate of decline is accelerating. And in the last quarter of 2011, on an annualized basis, the decline was 7% per annum. So the prediction is that the Greek economy will fall a further 7% this year. That will mean a total contraction of 20%. So we're talking about something in economic terms that is almost unparalleled. We are talking about youth unemployment rates now in Greece of 50%.
50%, correct, yeah.
50%. We are talking about huge numbers of homeless people setting up encampments on the outskirts of Athens and elsewhere. We are talking about hopelessness. We're talking about despair. And we're talking about people who have had taken from them the essential freedom that we all enjoy in a democracy, which is our right to sack our governors and to replace them with somebody else with a different manifesto. That's been robbed from them too. And desperate people take desperate measures. And that is why 80,000 people in Athens last week, and incidentally in other big Greek cities too, it's why they were storming the parliament last week in Athens. And my fear, my real fear, is that what these austerity measures will do is they will actually drive a desperate, hopeless people who have been robbed of their pride and self-respect. And we are risking actually forcing and causing a revolution in this country. It's that serious.
Now, Minister, recently you actually met Mrs. Merkel, and you actually posed that question: why not let Greece go? Why not let Greece restore a currency of its own so that it can devalue and then begin the road to recovery? It's going to be long and painful, but over the last 5 years there's been no progress. What did she actually say to you?
She said, Mr. Farage, we can't possibly do that, because if Greece was to leave the euro, other countries would follow too, and that would be the beginning of the end of our European project. So as I said in answer to your first question, there is a big political project and drive behind all of this, and therefore the Greek people have to be sacrificed on the altar of European Union. Otherwise, other countries will know that the game is up. And of course, in some ways, Angela Merkel is right, because when Greece, and I'm going to say when Greece, because this situation cannot go on.
Continue, yes.
It can't go on. But when Greece does leave the euro, and when, a few months down the road, people see that suddenly Greece's holiday bookings have gone through the roof because it's now a cheap, attractive place to go, and people see that rather like Iceland, who went bankrupt in 2008 but are now back to growth, that there is an alternative, then the other countries that should never have joined the euro in the first place, and I'm talking about Portugal, I'm talking about Spain, I'm talking about Ireland, and possibly even Italy too, will follow. So the European project, this idea that was sold on high ideals, but behind it all always had this huge, rather unpleasant nationalist agenda, is now, I think, beginning to be seen by the peoples of Europe not to be a force for good, but actually a force for bad.
Now, what happens, Minister, when other nations, Ireland, Portugal, but especially Spain and Italy. Spain and Italy are huge economies compared to Greece and compared to Portugal or even Ireland. What happens when these guys are in trouble? Will Merkel and the rest have enough money to pour into these countries? Will it not be? Will the game not be over once these countries have experienced the same problems that Greece is having? What will the EEC do then?
Well, that's right. And I mean, just to get some sense of perspective again on this, Greece only constitutes 3%
yep.
in size of the overall Eurozone economy. Portugal equally is a relatively small country. If this whole show moves on to Italy, and there were some signs in the markets before Christmas that may well be the case, it won't really matter then whatever Ponzi schemes they try and dream up in Brussels and Frankfurt. The problem will then have become bigger than the European Union and the International Monetary Fund combined. And we face, even when we get to that point, I'm not going to predict that Italy is going to go this year, but I sort of think it's 50-50. But we face the possibility of the markets just overwhelming the whole thing. And we may well then have chaos in Europe on a scale that up until now has been unimaginable.
Now, what do you believe is the essential problem with this monetary union between a group of countries with varying rates of economic growth? Now, for example, Britain has refused to join. Why is that?
Well, let me tell you a story. Back in 1990, I wasn't involved in politics at all. I was working in the city of London, buying and selling copper, aluminium, doing quite a lot of business in Australia and places like that.
Yep.
And I remember the day when I was told that the government, the British government, had joined the exchange rate mechanism. And in doing this, we pegged the level of sterling against the Deutschmark, and that was done as a stage towards us joining this full monetary union. Now, I won't tell you on a family program what my first utterances were, but let's say they were negative, shall we?
Sure.
And within 2 years, we found ourselves in this country, in Britain, with interest rates double what they should have been to maintain the level of sterling against the Deutschmark. We had a year of record house repossessions, record bankruptcies, and an extra 1 million people put on the unemployment register. And that was the day when I saw in my own country the Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat parties supporting this. That was the day that I became political. And so this whole question of monetary union between differing countries is the very thing that got me involved in politics in the first place. I believe in floating currencies between different countries and different economies. And all through history, we see attempts by governments to peg one currency against another. Snakes in tunnels, all sorts of different devices have been used to cause currency stability. And every single one of them fails. I mean, remember, it's just 10 years ago that the Argentinian peso was pegged against the dollar and crashed out. These things don't work, and when politicians think they understand markets and know what the correct level is, you can rest assured they have a 100% record of failure all through history, and so it is with this economic and monetary union project too. So really, Britain had a lucky escape, because we got the gypsies warning on this before everybody else. And that's why, mercifully, we've stayed out of it.
So what would you say would be the best course of action for Greece to follow in order to begin a road of recovery? They'd have to actually leave the monetary union and revert back to the drachma.
Well, there is no doubt, that Greece does have to get a grip on her public spending and get a grip on pension retirement ages and all the rest of it. Part of the problem is that when she joined the euro, she had 7 years of totally free money. 7 years when interest rates were half what they should have been in Greece, which of course led to this really very sort of lackadaisical attitude towards financial management. So the Greeks have got to get a grip. That is entirely true. It is also true that the scale of debts that the Greeks have are so big that they will never, ever be able to pay them off. So there is going to have to be a day of reckoning for the banks who made so much imprudent lending. So
they're going to have to accept some losses.
Absolutely. There's no question about that. You know, it is better to do a deal and get 30% of your money back than to get none of it back at all, it seems to me.
That's right.
But none of this works without stimulus. And the stimulus is that they need to go back to the drachma. The drachma would be reintroduced. It would probably be 2/3 lower in terms of value than where the euro currently is now. But that would suddenly make the Greek economy competitive again. Tourism, of course, is a massive, important part of what Greece does. I tell you what, the British particularly would flock to Greece in huge numbers.
Especially
when the prices on Monday morning that the cost of Greek holidays have been cut by 65%. So without that, I don't see any hope for this country at all. And for that to happen, it needs some politicians in Greece who've got some courage, some politicians who are prepared to stand up to these bully boys in Brussels. But, you know, that is the only formula that can possibly work, because if we go on as we are, as I said earlier in this interview, we will drive these people to a state where revolution will be inevitable, and I would like that to be avoided at all costs.
Now, okay, so that's as far as Greece is concerned. Now, what do you believe will eventually happen to this European monetary union? It will disappear, won't it?
Oh, yes, of course it will. I mean, it should never have been constructed in the way that it was. Those of us 10 years ago that were warning from the sidelines this couldn't work were all written off as being nutcases, and somehow these people in Brussels had developed a new economic model for the world. I mean, we've heard it all before through history. It's always wrong. And yes, those Mediterranean countries will, of course, all leave the Economic and Monetary Union, and we will finish up in the north of Europe with a euro area that is effectively a greater Deutschmark zone, and then there'll be political questions that the Dutch and Finns will have to ask themselves. Do we want to be part of something that is so German-dominated? But the contraction to a greater Deutschmark zone, and I think, we'll be there in 2 or 3 years' time.
Now, in a parting message to all our listeners in Australia, as well as our listeners in Greece, as well as all our Greek friends who are scattered all over the planet.
Well, my message to Greek people everywhere is have hope and have courage. Have hope because, remember, all through history, good always triumphs over evil in the end, and what is being done to your country is evil. I have no doubt about that. And have courage. It's no good just arguing that we must end the austerity measures. Even if we end the austerity measures, and even if much of your debt was written off, that still would not give the stimulus. Now, I know what's happening is the Greek government are saying to people, well, if we go back to the drachma and devalue, the value of your money will disappear. Well, the value of your money will disappear in terms of buying things abroad, but it won't disappear internally in Greece itself, and you need to have courage. The Greek people need to discover that pride and fighting spirit that is a part of them. They need to have the courage to get rid of their own career politicians who've been so craven in kowtowing to these bad people in Brussels, and be optimistic, because it may well be that this tragedy will end at some point in 2012. I really hope very much that it will. And my parting message to all Australians that are listening is I am a very keen cricket fan. I've followed the Ashes series. In fact, I've been to every Lord's Ashes test match since 1972. And it's just nice for once to know that we're actually above you in the world rankings. So I have a feeling that the next time we meet, my money would rather be on Australia than England.
It's been a pleasure to have you on the program today. I wish you all the best, and perhaps our paths will cross again, and hopefully under more favourable conditions for poor Greece.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.